Good evening for those who are in Brazil, and good morning for those who are in Australia. My name is Italo Lins Lemos. I'm one of the members of the organizing committee of the first International Colloquium in Philosophy Studies at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. I would like to welcome all of you to the session on environment and veganism with Professor Peter Singer from Princeton University and Professors Janine Sackler, Daniela Rosendo, and Maria Alice da Silva from the Federal University of Santa Catarina. I remind you that the questions may be asked to Professor Singer by the end of the session via the YouTube chat. Of course, Professor Singer probably won't have the opportunity to answer all the questions, given that I'm supposing there are going to be plenty of them. But some of the members of our scientific committee are going to select a couple of questions from the general public, and hopefully we're going to raise as many questions as is timely possible. Also, don't forget that the attendance list will be available on the YouTube chat really soon. Well, Professor Singer is the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University and a laureate professor at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics at the University of Melbourne. Professor Singer is a specialist in ethics and is well known for his books Practical Ethics, published in 1980, The Life You Can Save, Acting Now to End World Poverty, published in 2009, and in particular for Animal Liberation, published in 1975, in which he argues in favor of veganism. I would like to thank Professor Singer for accepting our invitation. And as a personal comment, I would also like to add that Professor Singer has been extremely kind and gentle for the last couple of months since I first sent him an email. I'm also really grateful for that. So without further ado, Professor Singer, it's an honor to have you here and welcome to Brazil.
Thank you very much, Professor Lemos, and everybody who's been involved in organizing this event. It's a pleasure to have the chance to speak to you and to other people in Brazil and elsewhere perhaps about what I regard as a very important issue, and that is the ethical questions regarding what we eat, and in particular regarding our consumption of animals and of animal products. As you know from the introduction that Professor Lemos just gave me, I go back a long way on this topic. My book, Animal Liberation, was first published in 1975. And in fact, I became a vegetarian in beginning of 1971. So it goes back a long way. And I want to talk to you today about both the reasons I had then for ceasing to eat meat and additional reasons that have emerged since that time. So going back to 1970, when I first started thinking about these issues, it was the treatment of animals that concerned me. And until that time, I had not really taken seriously the ethics of how we treat animals. Very few people had. It was simply not really a topic that was being discussed in the 1960s and early 1970s. It was not a topic that was taken seriously. I guess there was some concern about cruelty to dogs and cats and perhaps horses, but nobody really talked about the treatment of the animals we were eating. And I had grown up in Australia, and Australians produce a lot of meat, as does Brazil, of course, and eat a lot of meat as well. So I'd just taken that for granted. Until in 1970, when I had gone to Oxford as a graduate student to study philosophy, I met a Canadian student called Richard Keshen, who was a vegetarian. And that wouldn't be unusual today to meet another student who was a vegetarian, but it was very unusual then. And I asked him why he was a vegetarian, and he just gave me the very simple answer that he didn't think it was right to treat animals as the animal that I was then eating, because we were having this conversation over lunch, had been treated. And I really didn't know very much about the treatment of animals, but I assumed that all the animals I'd been eating had had good lives until, of course, then they got taken to the slaughterhouse and killed. So they had a very bad day for the last day of their life, but I didn't think it was so bad. But he said no, already then by 1970, many animals were being reared indoors in factory farms, and he recommended a book by Ruth Harrison called Animal Machines, which was the first and at that time the only book to talk about this development of the treatment of animals. And I read it, and I read a few other things that one could find at the time. And I was shocked to realize that producing animals had been turned into an industry in which, as Ruth Harrison said, cruelty is acknowledged only when profitability ceases. In other words, anything that you could do to the animals that was profitable was not considered cruel. It was only when conditions got so bad that the animals died or didn't produce that people might start thinking about whether this was right. But unfortunately, that allows for an immense amount of cruelty, because it's the economics of the whole system that counts in this kind of industrial production of animals. It's not the welfare or even the productivity of the individual animal. And I was able to establish that by looking at farming journals, at scientific journals, basically advising farmers how to produce their products more cheaply and more economically. And you can actually find articles which say, for example, about the production of eggs from caged hens, that if you have, this is the standard sized cage that was being used then, it's a cage sort of about this big. If you have 4 hens in that cage, they will have a higher survival rate and they will lay more eggs. But if you have 5 hens in a cage like that, although the chances of the hens dying increase, it's still more economic because the cost of the cage is the same, the cost of running the whole shed, ventilating the shed, the labor costs are the same. So the fact that it's more likely that one of the birds will die or that the stress will mean that they lay a small number of fewer eggs doesn't outweigh the fact that you get more eggs per unit, per shed, even if you get fewer eggs per bird. And that is a pattern that exists throughout this industrial agriculture. I saw another article about beef cattle dying from heat in hot summers in Texas, in the United States. And it said, well, you can put up some shade, you can erect a roof over part of the feedlot that they're in so that in hot weather the animals can go under the shade. And fewer of them will die. But actually the number of lives that you save and the fact that you have more animals you send to market doesn't repay you for the cost of putting up the roof. So why do it from an economic point of view? So it's that attitude to animals that dominates corporate agriculture. And when you think about the ethics of this, I think that this cannot possibly be justified. I started looking at that because I was a philosophy student, and I started looking at ethical justifications about how we treat animals, about the moral status of animals. And this was the other sort of revelation. So one, as I say, thing that I learned was the facts about the situation. But the other was that I'd never really thought seriously about the moral status of animals, how animals should be treated, and why we were justified in regarding ourselves as having a special moral status that no animals have. Because, of course, it's part of our belief that there's a sense in which all humans are equal. We all have equal rights and an equal moral status. We say our lives are of equal worth. But while that may be a noble sentiment in many respects for treating human beings, it actually also draws a line between humans and animals. And it says we humans have this special moral status. We humans are all equal, but non-human animals are not. And that's something that I had never questioned, but that I then started to think about, well, what can justify this? why should there be this sharp difference of moral status between humans and animals? And I started to see that, of course, humans support and accept this idea and don't challenge it because it benefits us. It benefits us because then we get to use animals not only for food in the ways that I described, but also as subjects of our experiments, to wear their furs in cold weather, and for amusement in bullfighting or other activities in some cultures, for a whole lot of different ways. And so we don't challenge it because we're the beneficiaries. It struck me that this is similar to, for example, living in the American South in the first half of the 19th century, when they didn't really challenge the ideology that allowed them to make slaves of African Americans. That also, of course, benefited them in many ways, and so that ideology was accepted, that this was the right way to treat African Americans, that this was justifiable. And then we had, this was after all the early 1970s, we had the feminist movement making similar points about male ideologies with regard to women, which also, of course, advantage men, and therefore was not challenged among men. And while men remained the powerful ones in a community, it wasn't that easy to change that ideology either. But by 1970, these ideologies had been powerfully challenged by African Americans, by women, and yet the ethics of how we treat animals had not been challenged. And one reason for that, of course, is that the animals themselves can't challenge it. So it's really necessary for humans to act as advocates for animals in order to challenge this idea. And that's what seems to me necessary to do. We can't really justify saying that all humans have a superior moral status to all non-human animals, because, after all, there isn't really a sharp boundary in terms of any capacities that we have that they don't have. The boundary that we use is just the boundary of species. If you're a human being, you have a certain moral status. If you're not, you don't. But that can't really be a morally relevant thing. And if we talk about things that might be morally relevant, like rationality or autonomy or self-awareness, capacity to act morally, these are matters of degree, and not all humans have them to the same extent. And indeed, some humans, those, for example, with profound intellectual disabilities, might have them to a lesser degree than some non-humans, like chimpanzees or elephants, perhaps, or dolphins. So if those are the relevant characteristics, there ought to be an overlap. But we don't accept this overlap, and we certainly don't treat those intellectually disabled humans in the way we treat animals. So there's something going on that I refer to as speciesism, to make the parallel with racism and sexism. So that's the basic argument that I put forward in Animal Liberation, and that although it's been discussed a lot by philosophers over the 45 years since then, it's, I think, basically still sound. I don't think the argument has been shown to be unsound in any substantial way. But since then, there have been additional reasons why I think it's important for us to avoid eating animals, or at the very least reduce our consumption of animals, and limit it to certain particular cases. And the most important of these emerged, I became aware of anyway, in the 1980s, when I learned about the fact that we are warming the planet, that this has great potential danger for the future of the planet and for the future of all humans and non-human animals on the planet, and that it's not only use of fossil fuels that causes this problem, but it is also the consumption of meat, and particularly the consumption of meat from ruminant animals, which basically means cattle and sheep. This is a major factor in the emission of greenhouse gases, in particular methane, which ruminants emit as part of their digestive process. And according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the livestock industry produces as much greenhouse gases as the entire transport sector, as all of the cars and trucks and aeroplanes and ships and everything else that we move around the planet. So if that's right, that means that after the production of electricity, stationary energy, it's the next biggest producer of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's also a relatively easier one to stop, because whereas to replace fossil fuels in the production of energy is a major project, obviously, that requires building new forms of power, and there is some additional cost to that, at least in many situations. Cutting out meat, and particularly cutting out red meat, is something that every individual could do starting tomorrow. When I say every individual, there may be some people who couldn't find alternatives in particular areas of sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps, where the land is arid and they sustain themselves from their cattle. But for people in other circumstances who can walk into a supermarket and choose whether to buy meat or some plant-based product instead that will provide similar nutrition, it's a relatively easy thing to do. So that, I think, is the most is the second important reason for avoiding the consumption of meat. The third reason is a much more recent one that we've become more recently aware of, and has got particular prominence at this moment, and that is that there are health risks associated with the mass production of meat and with the consumption of meat in general. In fact, the pandemic that most of the world is suffering from right now has come to humans because of our consumption of animals. Through the wet market in Wuhan, in which captured wild animals were held in cages and slaughtered on the spot. And it seems that the virus may have traveled from bats to pangolins, which are eaten by people in China, and thus to humans. So all of the misery and death and economic slowdown that is happening now is because of our consumption of animals. Now, you might say, oh, well, okay, but, I don't eat bats or pangolins, and so there's nothing that I need to do about that. But in fact, for many years, health experts have been warning that factory farms are a major risk in terms of starting new viruses and new pandemics. And we don't have to go back very far to see that that is correct, because the previous pandemic, the swine flu pandemic of 2009, which also killed a lot of people, not as many as the current coronavirus pandemic, but killed by some estimates more than 500,000 people, started from a factory farm, probably in North Carolina, although there's some suggestions that one in Mexico may have been involved as well. But it was a pig factory farm. And then we've had various local outbreaks of avian flu, which have come from chicken farms, I think mostly in Southeast Asia in this case. And those who look at this situation say, well, if you wanted to create a new virus that would be transmitted to humans, one way of doing it would be to put tens of thousands of animals together in a single building, put them under a lot of stress, and if viruses develop and mutate within those tens of thousands of animals, they would spread very quickly. And if you then have humans who go among them, for example, to round them up and catch them and take them to slaughter, the viruses could be transmitted to humans and you could get a pandemic happening that way. So this is a clear further risk. And now that we see how dangerous a pandemic can be, how costly a pandemic can be, and we heed the warnings that, in fact, this pandemic, although very contagious, is not very lethal, but there's no reason why you couldn't have equally contagious pandemic that was much more lethal, then I think this shows that this is a third powerful reason for avoiding factory farming, which would mean, if not the total elimination of animal products, at least a very great reduction of animal products. So those are the three reasons that I want to talk about for avoiding animal products. I did not talk about the personal health issues, that is whether you'll be healthier yourself through not eating animals. Personally, I believe that that is the case, but I'm not an expert in health and nutrition, so I tend to leave that argument to those who have more expertise in that area. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to questions and to hearing from the other speakers in this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Singer. Now I'm going to invite Professor Daniela Rosendo, who is a postdoc researcher at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. She's a specialist in ethics, and the main topic of her research is popular ecofeminist education. She is a researcher from the Núcleo de Ética Prática at UFSC, Laboratório de Ética Ambiental e Animal at UF, and Marginais, Grupo Interdisciplinar de Pesquisa sobre Minorias e Exclusões at UFOB. Professor Daniela Rosendo, thank you for coming.
Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Professor Singer. It's an honor and a great pleasure to be here. So I'd like to start thanking the University of Santa Catarina, the Federal University of Santa Catarina, and especially the postgraduate program of philosophy for inviting me to this lecture and to engage in this debate with Professor Singer. And I would like also to thank the opportunity of being here with my colleagues Janine Sattler and Maria Elise. So thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Singer. And I recently read your book, and it's very good to see how you've been thinking about these issues of animal ethics and veganism. And I'm vegan for 15 years now, and so this is a main concern for me. So I do agree with you about these reasons why we should not eat animals. So first for the animals, and then climate change. And in Brazil, as you know, we have a problem with deforestation. So climate change is an important issue for everyone. And I think especially here in Brazil, in our context, including because it directly impacts indigenous and Black people. And health as also a main concern, and now COVID-19. But I'd like to add one more concern for why we should not eat animals. And it is a political concern regarding a plural sense of justice. But it's based, but a plural sense of justice that is based on a care-sensitive ethics. So I hope I may be able to explicit a little bit more about my way of viewing this as it follows. So my interest in animal ethics started when I became a vegetarian in 2005. And I realized that I was not eating meat anymore, and I was wondering why. Then I started researching about the vegetarian diet, and I was soon introduced to the ethical treatment of all animals, including cows and chickens. At that time, I had no idea about the treatment of such exploitation of females and other species, especially for the production of milk, dairy products, and eggs. At the time, I was not even aware that fishes are sentient beings and therefore able to feel pain. Being sympathetic to the suffering of other animals, I decided to become vegan. By the time, I also met the work of the Brazilian philosopher and Professor Sônia Felipe. And that's when I first had contact with your work, Professor Singer. Sônia Felipe has a book from 2003 on your theory about animal ethics. And after knowing about the equal consideration of interests and the theory of animal rights from Thornrigan, for example, I started to justify my ethical perspectives and attitudes on the rational arguments presented on these theories. So it was in 2008 when Professor Sônia Felipe started a research project on ecofeminism that I confronted the very foundations of my interspecies relations. As Marty Kiel told us in her presentation at the Federal University of Santa Catarina when she was here in 2010, just a year before her death, in the traditional theories of animal rights and ethics, there is no room for empathy and the foundation of these theories. But the very reason why I became not only vegan, but an animal rights defender, animal rights here in a broader sense, engaged in animal rights movement was my empathy for the use, exploitation, abuse, and oppression of all animals. So the gender and the feminist lens were a powerful tool, being myself a woman living in a patriarchal society, to understand how all isms of domination like sexism, racism, ableism, classism, speciesism, and others isms are all related. That's why I've been dedicating my research to build and to defend an ethical, political, ecofeminist project grounded in the ethics of care and a plural justice. I mean by that a social, environmental, and interspecies justice. So I believe that the ethics of care offers us a powerful way of seeing and establishing our relations with others, humans and other than humans. I refer to an ethics of care in the stage we have reached so far, meaning that it's not a partial ethic that may also reinforce the whole of women as responsible for caring. On the contrary, redistributive justice means also that reproductive work and caring must also be redistributed in our society. Tânia Kuhnen, another Brazilian philosopher and professor, defends the universal principle of care, for example. Through this principle, we can establish care practices which considers the interests and needs of each being in its own context. That being said, I'd like to address you two questions. First, how can we think of the well-being and the interests of others beings outside the idea of care relations? And that question leads me to another. The ethical, political, ecofeminist project has been helping us to critically address systematic patterns of oppression and, on the other hand, construe ethical and just interspecies relations. So it helps us to listen to the animals, to comprehend their experiences and establish relations that contribute to their flourishing, considering the epistemic injustice they are historically subjected to as other human beings, such as non-white, for example, due to colonialism and other isms of domination. So in your opinion, how can we listen to animals when advocating for them, as you said in your presentation?
Thank you. I'm not quite clear actually on the format, whether should I answer the questions that you've answered now, or should we hear from all of the speakers and then I'll just come back at the end? Well, I don't remember whether this
Professor
was...
Singer, it's one at a time. So you can answer Professor Daniela, then we're going to ask Professor Maria Elise, and so it goes.
Fine. Okay, good. Well, thank you very much, Professor Daniela, for your interesting presentation, which I enjoyed listening to. So the specific questions, perhaps the basic one, I think, is the first one. How can we think of the interests of others outside care relations? Well, there is a fundamental question of the nature of ethics here as to whether it only exists within relations between individuals, or whether, and in that sense is based on something emotional, if you like, a feeling of care, or whether it has a rational basis. And although I do think that our emotions and our feelings are extremely important in motivating us towards treating others well, I also think that there is a rational basis for this. And that basis, for me, perhaps is best put by the late 19th century English philosopher Henry Sidgwick, who used the phrase taking the point of view of the universe, which is not to say that he thought the universe actually has a point of view, but rather that we can detach ourselves from our own position and look at the world and ask ourselves what makes the world better or worse. And he thought, and I think when we do that, it's basically the well-being of the sentient creatures in the world that makes it better or worse. So if there is more suffering in the world, then from the point of view of the universe, it's a worse place, if you like. From a detached point of view, we can see that it's a worse place. And for Sidgwick, this is like a self-evident rational axiom. And if beings are content with their lives or happy or experiencing pleasure, that's a good thing. And I think, although I accept, as I said, that feelings are important, I think we have to go beyond them. I was reminded in listening to Professor Daniela of reading, I think perhaps the first book of this caring ethic by Nell Noddings, which, if I remember rightly, was called something like Caring. And I was somewhat shocked, I have to say, when I read what she says both about animals and about helping people in extreme poverty in other countries. Because on animals, I remember quite vividly, she says something like, if you have a relationship with a cow, let's say, you're on a farm and you have a few cows and you give them names, you call them Daisy or Bessie or whatever people call cows, then it would be wrong to kill it and eat it. But if you have no relationship with the animal, it's completely anonymous to you, it just comes to you as a piece of meat in the supermarket, then you don't have any relationship, you don't owe it any duty of care, and therefore it's okay to eat it. And she said something rather similar about helping people in poverty elsewhere in the world, that if you develop a relationship, some people adopt a child, for example, a needy child in a low-income country, then you develop a relationship, then you have an obligation to help that child. But if you're just helping strangers who you don't know and have no relationship with, you don't have that obligation. And that, I think, is a very unfortunate attitude to have to dealing with extreme poverty, because it's demonstrably much less effective to help an individual child than to do something like distribute bed nets against malaria in a village where malaria is killing children. And of course, you'll never know, if you donate to that organization, you'll never know whose life you saved. You don't have any relationship with the people in the village or the child you saved. But I still think that's the right thing to do. So that's why I would say we can develop an ethic and concern for the interests of those outside caring relationships. And I think it's important that we do. Just more briefly on your second question, we do have to listen to animals about their lives. And the best way to do that really is to look at the work of people who have done that by observing them very closely, and then they can tell us things. So scientists who understand the behavior of chickens or pigs or cows recognize that they are stressed and bored and confined when they're confined in factory farms. They recognize subtle forms of behavior that somebody who's not an expert might not, like the kind of stereotypical movements, repeated movements, noddings of their heads or something like that, which is similar, like if you go to a zoo, one of those bad old zoos where lions or tigers are kept in concrete cages with steel bars and they pace back and forth all day. That's a stereotypical movement. They're trying to deal with their frustration at not being able to move more widely by that pacing. And factory farm animals do the same. And, you know, this goes all the way to Professor Daniela mentioned fish. So again, scientists who observe fish can see how they respond and can see what they like and what they dislike, what's painful to them. So I think we now have increasing amount of knowledge of this because of the work of scientists in observing animal behavior. And that's the best way we can listen to the animals that we are not in close personal relationships to. Obviously, if we are in close relationships with companion animals, we can listen to them more directly, but most of us are not for chickens or pigs or cows or fish. And I think we have to look at that body of scientific knowledge.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Italo.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Singer, on your considerations. Yeah, actually, in fact, Noddings is what we consider a theorist in the first stage of the ethics of care, and from an animal perspective, it's really has its limits. So that's why we have been developing this theory of the care ethics with this ecofeminist or animalist lens. So thank you very much again.
Good. Thanks. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much, Professor Daniela. Now moving forward, I would like to introduce Professor Maria Elise da Silva, who is a professor of philosophy at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. She's a specialist in ethics and political philosophy, and the main topic of her research is the relation between humans and other animals. She's a researcher from the Observatório de Justiça Ecológica at UFSC. So, Professor Maria Elise da Silva, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Vitalo. Good evening and good morning, everybody. It's an enormous pleasure to participate in this event. Firstly, for being with Daniela Rosendo and Janine Sattler, two brilliant philosophers of Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, and then for having the opportunity to share my impressions about how piercing studies are viewed by our student researchers and vegan activists. Most of all, due to his first works about the end of the all-century animal exploitation impact. However, of course, there is however, I confess that I was a little worried about accepting the invitation because of the use English, but I have changed my mind, understanding the importance of my presence as a Brazilian specialist on the subject. Beyond that, there is a militant attitude in understanding English was a functional language and challenge my speaking skill as a Latin woman. For last but not least, I would like to honor Sonia Filippi, a professor who introduced animal ethics in our department. My research is about animal rights, the fundamentals of animal rights in an ethical, political, and legal perspective. By the way, this is the title of my recent released book, and defends the importance of structurally established a range of rights and guarantees through public law and policy. Despite the importance of singers' individual responsibility, I consider that it is necessary to have material conditions that enable individual choice. I mean, individual choices also depend on a social structure. So, question number one. In Brazil, we face difficulties in the interpretation of animal liberation in utilitarianism, and this is due to the use of utility in a pejorative sense, as a possibility of bargain or take advantage in some situation in an individual perspective, generally speaking. The sense of utility is not generally associated with an impression sense related to moral commitment with the collective. I think there is a confusion caused by the incomprehension of the utilitarianism rigor. Professor Singer, do you believe that a considerable part of the questions and criticisms about your studies has something to do with the misunderstanding about what in fact is utilitarianism? Now, question number 2. In your new book, Why Vegan, there is a change of important ideas for those who knew your previous works. I was even quite surprised by your defense with insufficient scientific evidence about the censure of some animals like fish and the purpose of humanitarian slaughter. And so, in this sense, does the benefit of the doubts that your work on in the book Practical Ethics seem to be opposite of the justification for flexible veganism? Is it worth defending a flexible veganism, even under risk of losing the compromise of the utility, compromise with collective and all session animals? And question number 3. In your new book, you present a range of examples of Europe and global North practices on the advance and protection of animals. However, you seem to disregard that some demands and companies have started to place other locations in the world, and that exploitation in the global south continues to grow in relation to human, non-human animals, and with a great climatic impact. Early this year, Australia suffered for fires, and there was a very different worldwide perspective compared to what happened with fire in the Pantanal here in Brazil, where in only 6 months, almost 30,000 acres of native vegetation was deforested. The concern not only the suffering caused, but institutional responsibility, and the way the world seems and deals with different realities. To sum up, in the context, how can we relate to individual agents' responsibility and the lack of a socially imposed structure found to consider contextual justification? Is it possible to have an argument in practical ethics and in the environmental issues separate from social justice? What do you think about this, Professor? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Maria Elise. A lot of very interesting questions, and don't worry about your English. It's fine. I wish I could speak Portuguese to you, and then we wouldn't have this issue, but I'm sorry. Your first question was about utilitarianism and misunderstandings of utilitarianism. There certainly are misunderstandings of utilitarianism. There's no question about that. Some people think of it as, there was this unfortunate remark which actually Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, at one point said about the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And then he realized actually himself in his own lifetime that this is misleading people into thinking that if something is good for 51%, then it's right. But that's not what he meant, of course. He did mean really that we have to take into account the happiness and the suffering of everyone, and we have to weigh them up so that something might be good for 51%, but much, much worse for a very small number, maybe even only 1%, but so bad for the 1% that outweighs the benefit for 99%. So it's not that utilitarianism is indifferent to the sufferings of minorities. That certainly is a misunderstanding. And it's not also that utilitarianism cannot support ideas about rights for the worst off. It can. It's not based on rights fundamentally. That's a difference, for instance, that I've had with the late Tom Regan in the area of animals. My view is not based on rights fundamentally, but I'm quite prepared to talk about animal rights as something that societies should have as a barrier to mistreatment of animals, that they should have in law, perhaps, or in social convention and customs. Both human and non-human rights can certainly play a role. So I do think that some of the problems are misunderstandings of utilitarianism, but of course there are also genuine differences of ethical views between utilitarians and others. There are some people, and particularly this is a view that the Catholic Church holds, so you would know about it in Brazil, that there are some things that are just absolutely wrong and that one must never do no matter what. So, for example, the rule about intentionally killing an innocent human being, according to mainstream Catholic thinking, that's something that is always wrong, no matter what the consequences. And that's why the Catholic Church has opposed voluntary euthanasia, even for people who are terminally ill and requesting it and are fully competent, whereas that's something that as a utilitarian I support. I don't want to see needless suffering, and if somebody is dying and they judge that their quality of life is no longer worth living and the doctors say it's never going to improve, it's going to just keep getting worse until you die, I don't see why, if a doctor is willing to help them to die, they should not be able to use that. So there are both real differences and misunderstandings. Your second question related to what I wrote in Why Vegan about sentience, and I'm not sure quite what you're referring to, because what I did say there is that I think that there are different degrees of evidence for the suffering of different kinds of beings. So where we have birds and mammals, I think we can be completely sure, or as completely sure as you can ever be of anything in science, 99.9% sure, if you like, that they suffer in ways, they can suffer in ways that are similar to us. When we come to fish, they are vertebrates, and they have a central nervous system, and they have a brain, and I think it's also extremely probable that they can suffer. But there have been some questions raised because of differences in the brain structure by some scientists. I think that there are other scientists who've shown that fish can suffer, particularly the work of Victoria Braithwaite in a book called Do Fish Feel Pain? I think establishes pretty clearly that fish can suffer, so I don't really have any doubts about that, any serious doubts. I just think it's slightly less certain than that birds and mammals can suffer. If we do come down to some other animals, to some invertebrates, not all invertebrates, because I think the behavior of the octopus shows that an octopus is clearly a conscious being and is able to suffer. But with insects, I think it's less clear whether they can suffer or not. Maybe some of them can and some of them can't. And I wrote in Why Vegan that I'm not really strictly vegan because I don't mind eating oysters or clams or mussels, the group of shellfish known as bivalves. And that's because I think it's very unlikely that they can suffer. After all, I think that probably the capacity for pain evolved in order to enable animals to move away from something that was a threat to their existence. And yet clams and mussels can't move away, so I think it's less likely that they can suffer. Also, they don't have a centralized nervous system in the same way that vertebrates do. So I think that there's not really a problem, and as long as they're environmentally harvested or grown, I don't see a big problem with that. The more general question about being flexible about veganism is actually consistent with my utilitarianism, because you could look at it this way. Would it be better to, let's say we have now, it varies from country to country, but let's say we have 3% of a country who are vegans, and ask yourself, would it be better if we could increase from 3% complete vegans to 5% complete vegans? Or would it be better if we could get the other 97% of the population to eat vegan 2 days a week or 3 days a week or whatever? And obviously, if you add up the number of animals who would be spared suffering, it would be much better if we could get the 97% to be vegan 2 or 3 days a week than to go from 3% pure vegans to 5% pure vegans. So that's why, as a utilitarian, I don't want to be recommending a very strict form of veganism, because I think it's less likely that it will spread. I would rather more people took up vegan products and perhaps saw themselves on a path towards veganism as gradually moving in that direction and reducing their consumption of animal products, because I think it's more likely that that will actually spread quite rapidly. Your third question was about problems of the global south and whether it's up to individual agents or social structures. So again, as a utilitarian, I want to see change happen. And obviously, if we can change social structures so that the global power structures and the global trading system and institutions like the United Nations or the World Trade Organization are not run so much in the influence in the interests of the affluent countries, but are run more in the interests of the entire world, then that would be a better thing. But it's very difficult to produce those changes. And while I certainly think we should work to produce those changes, I think we can also do things as individuals. And that's why I often in my writing, I appeal to individuals to change their behavior, because I think that's something that we can all do, and it does make a difference in various ways. Affluent people can help those in extreme poverty in developing countries. They can do that directly. They can also lobby for a more fair and just trading system, but that may take decades to happen. And in the meantime, there are things we can do to help particular people. So the same is true of climate change. Climate change is going to be much worse for people in low-income countries, and we need to try to change the political structures. We need to support international agreements. That's one reason why the election of Joseph Biden is so important, because he will take the United States back into the Paris Agreement and help to strengthen that structure again. But we can also do things as individuals in terms of reducing our own footprint of greenhouse gases and set an example through our own lifestyle. And I think that's important too. So thank you again very much, Professor Maria Elise, for your interesting questions and thoughts. And I hope I've managed to answer some of them.
Thank you. About question 1, I think there is a confusion caused by the incomprehension of the utilitarianism rigor and its argument in the world of animal liberation, which are different from the term liberation within ethics absolutism. But the term liberation is not necessary in absolute value, like a moral religion. I believe that this confusion is a lack of knowledge about the ethics grounds. And thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. That's quite possible that's the confusion that's going on. Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much, Professor Maria Elise. Now, I would like to invite Professor Janine Sattler, who is a professor of philosophy at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. She's a specialist in ethics, aesthetics, and political philosophy, and the main topics of her research are ethics and aesthetics in Wittgenstein, Stoic ethics, literature and philosophy, feminist philosophy, and gender studies. She is a researcher from the Núcleo de Ética e Filosofia Política at UFSC, Instituto de Estudos de Gênero at UFSC, and she is vice coordinator of the GT de Filosofia e Gênero at UNPOF. Professor Janine Sattler, thank you for coming.
Well, first of all, thank you, Italo, and all the organizers for inviting me and for this opportunity to talk to my colleagues and Peter Singer. And so thank you also, Peter Singer, for your talk. I will do something a little bit different, reading a piece I wrote. And it might look to you as not pro-veganism, but you are not, but do not be mistaken. I am a vegan, and what I am doing is much more like a conceptual, methodological, non-normative enterprise. So I will read, and I may not have question exactly, or maybe I have a very radical question, but then we can see about that. So, dear Peter Singer, it is a pleasure and an honor to be here and to listen to and to talk to you in the company of these fighting friends of mine. I became a vegan due to my reading of animal liberation. From then on, however, I took some very different paths to pursue my reflections about non-human animals, ecofeminism, environmental responsibility, and justice. Some of the paths I took have to do with a bunch of other readings connecting philosophy and literature. I know you have done some of that yourself as well. However, in what follows, my own purpose is not in any sense to deploy a philosophical argument in literary form. Instead, I would like for you to see the narrative for what it is. And if there are indeed important concepts here, they are completely enmeshed and entangled in the literary experience itself, and my own shared bodily human experience and memory for what it's worth. There is no question here other than this one. Can we really save ourselves and human value and non-human value in view of a dignified survival on Earth? Can we save ourselves in the face of our actions of violence and injustice? When I was about 5, I had a little gray cat named Popeye. I have no idea why. I have some pictures with him, sunbathing in the backyard. I don't exactly know why I never forgot him. Maybe because of the pictures. As it happens with the pictures of my great-grandmother. I don't really remember my great-grandmother, the one speaking Polish, Portuguese, German, Italian. Is this craving for languages her inheritance? This old immigrant woman living in the midst of the crop fields built over Brazilian indigenous bodies. But I do never forget her either, and I do still miss her terribly, even if I was about 3 when she passed away. It seems she was fond of cats, stories, and headscarves. Then later on, there was this yellow cat named the cat. This poor guy, and poisoned and left alone and to die by the hand, and I mean literally, of a man I profoundly disliked. And maybe now I think of it because he was capable of doing it, to put him out of his misery. How could that be of any consolation at all? The cat brought the need for cats. Then there was Katie, and she was a brave, violent, loyal companion, whom I saw for the first time in my own life as a living creature full of being, to breathe her long last breath into giving her soul away, or back to the universe, who knows. And then again, there was Aninha, whom I myself had to bring to breathe no more, watching her to give herself to my own hands trustingly. I betrayed her, my own chance of putting someone out of her misery. She was 14 years old, but how could that be of any consolation at all? 6 months later, I felt betrayed myself by my grandmother, my mother's mother, who could not wait for me and my brother to arrive to say goodbye. We were caught by that halfway. You see, I am a vegan for something like 15 years now, and my grandmother, this peasant woman, turned one because there was no other path to go for the, although once urban and learned, now married and migrant woman she was. My grandmother was one of the most important people in my life. I had seen her with the chicken to die, the piglets to die, the cow to milk, the horrifying hunting stories of her husband and of her father-in-law, the one who lost a leg in a hunting shooting. And yet, how could I turn my face to this affectionate evening popcorn she had made for us, popped with lard, when I came to say farewell before my long-distance departure? I was not even sure I would ever be able to see her again. I do miss her terribly. And although I was deeply hurt by her silencing about indigenous inhabitants in the very land of my birth, of whom I'm still so profoundly ignorant, I am still accomplishing things and coping with my own life in a desperate attempt to do justice to her and to my mother, both of whom would make the best of feminist vegetarian fighters, the best of feminist listeners. Had they ever had a chance of surmounting survival, agricultural capitalist oppression, greenish monoculturalism, male and patriarchal dominance, law education, structural and unplanned destiny? Understanding reality, hearing the non-human voices, hearing animal women voices. How can that be of any consolation at all? This all hurts as much as it does, and it has nothing to do with my dead cats to have been sentient beings, even if their sufferings and well-being meant a lot to me while they were there, nor with my grandmother to have been a rational, intelligent, and a being with interests of her own, even if the injustices she had to deal with along the whole of her life injured the heart of her soul. But it has to do with souls. They are unique, irreplaceable souls, and the meanings their souls offered for life to have a meaning, and the meanings their souls offered to the lives of all the beings surrounding them while they were there and after they parted. Because remember them, even if we don't. It has to do with the life we built in connection, human and non-human animals, human and bodies, full of being bodies. We could as well be talking about butterflies, couldn't we? Now my godfather is dying. He had a full life of love and misery. He lost his right fingers while working himself up to a shoe factory. Capitalist, monopolist shoe factory. He then retired and found some comfort in the love of his grandchildren. But he is now vulnerably sick. I look to his dry-up face, his skinny legs, and his never-repaired hand, and I cannot blame him for having been greedy about alcohol and meat. Can I? He and my father used to do the whole of the housework my grandmother would not do while working in the fields. So they were both autonomous boys, grown up to be autonomous men. They are both facing age now and pandemic loneliness and distance. But what the hell does that have to do with animals in any sense? Vulnerability, I guess, might be a possible answer, and care, and being kind to loving creatures. It has to do with souls. They are unique, irreplaceable souls, and the meanings their souls offer for life to have a meaning, and the meanings their souls offer to the lives of all the beings surrounding them while they are here. It has to do with the life we build in connection, human and non-human animals, human and bodies, full of being bodies, men and women, and no gender beings, and no social hierarchical normativity. We could be talking about birds, reptiles, and babies, couldn't we? And it has also to do with a non-negotiable need for a world which is safe for workers not to weird their lives for the money they never make enough for themselves. Safe for women to choose their path out of their human hearts. Safe for cats to be loved and to be remembered not as pets, but as unique, irreplaceable souls, as souls full of being. I know. How do I even dare to narrate cats and grandmothers and godfathers in the same piece of feelings? And cats and pigs cause butterflies, birds, reptiles, and babies. How do I even dare? Well, you see, it has all to do with the life of meaning we build in connection. Or, as vulnerability makes it clear, on every occasion, it has to do with our failings to offer justice. But justice as love and as embodied generosity, not as law or norm or judgment, or failings to respond to them as sharing inhabitants of the world we live in. Justice as a possibility of seeing the other in its fullest, deepest reality. Justice as an attitude towards a soul. So there is no question here other than this one. Are we able to do it? Thank you for your attention. I guess this is a very difficult question to answer.
Thank you very much, Professor Janine Sattler. Yes, it is a difficult narrative to reply to. I'm reminded somewhat of the occasion when I was asked to respond to the Tanner lecture by J.M. Coetzee, which he gave at Princeton University in 1998. And it was part of what became the novel Elizabeth Costello. Some of you may have read it. It was published also separately in a book called The Lives of Animals, with a response by myself and 3 other people. And I felt that because I was dealing with a work of fiction, instead of giving a lecture, as you know, this is a regular lecture series we have at Princeton. Usually people come and give a conventional academic lecture, but instead Coetzee, as a great novelist, read a piece of fiction. But it was a piece of fiction that was very directly about animals and presented this views of somebody coming to a university, an elite American university, to give a lecture about animals and the way people responded to it. So I felt at that time I could only respond by writing a work of fiction myself, which I attempted to do. I'm not a fiction writer. I don't have any claims to do that well. But for a short response, I think it worked. So I have some of the same difficulty with less time to prepare, I guess, to respond to your very interesting thoughts. But let me start, perhaps instead of responding, just say that I do come from a very different kind of philosophical approach to the world, and this goes back to the utilitarianism which was already been raised, because utilitarianism is says that the right action to do is the one that will have the best consequences. And of course, in thinking about the consequences of our actions, we are future-oriented. We think more about what we can change from now on. And understanding the past is important to that, because understanding the past is a kind of a warning against what could happen. I think it was George Santayana who said, those who don't remember the past are condemned to relive it. And so certainly it's important to think about the past, to think about mistakes that we have made, to think about mistakes that others have made, to think about mistakes that civilizations as a whole have made. And I think what you did in your narrative relates to all of these things. But I focus more on how we can make the world better, what are the positive things we can do to reduce suffering, both for humans and for non-human animals, to reduce some of the hardships that you talked about, to reduce some of the wrongs that you talked about, the injustices, the violence, those things that have been done. As I said in response to Professor Maria Elise, I think that there are some things that we would like to change if we could, but that are very, very difficult to change. And I think you touched upon some of those things when saying, just giving the voice to the aspiration for a world without violence, without injustices based on gender, based on hierarchy, based on colonialism and its relics, and a whole lot of other things. So yes, we would like to change those things, but some of them we don't really know how to change, I think. I have this experience sometimes when I talk, particularly not so much about animals, but when I talk about global poverty and talk about the organizations that we can support and that as affluent people I think should support to help those in extreme poverty. And quite often when I give that talk to a public audience, somebody stands up and says, look, isn't the problem global capitalism? And so what you're talking about, I mentioned, for example, supporting organizations that distribute bed nets against malaria or operate on people's eyes, cataract surgery, which I just had here in Australia, but in poorer countries, people go blind because they have cataracts and they can't get them treated. They can't afford it. Aren't they just treating the symptoms? And shouldn't we really be trying to overthrow global capitalism? To which, my response is, do you know how to do that? Do you have any idea as to how that might be possible? And even if it were possible, what is your system that you want to put in its place? We've had experiences in the 20th century with attempts to replace global capitalism, and essentially they didn't work. I think the Soviet communist system, certainly under Stalin, was a worse system than global capitalism. Maybe you can have better forms of socialism, but it's hard to find ones that have been tried and have lasted, endured, and proved to be a kind of model or example that we could all follow. So that's why I suppose I focus on the achievable, on where we can make a difference. And looking at those things, I have a less bleak view of the world than I think your narrative gave us, because I do see progress being made. I see progress being made in respect of global poverty, maybe not this year because the coronavirus has certainly been a major setback. And I agree that climate change is a big threat to the global poor. But looking at the trajectories over the last decade or so, I do see a lot of progress. When I wrote the first edition of my book, The Life You Can Save, which was written in 2008 and published the following year, I quoted a figure from the United Nations Children's Foundation that 9.8 million children died before their 5th birthday, overwhelmingly because of poverty-related causes. When I did the new edition, which came out last year, the figure had fallen to 5.3 million. So that's a big drop, almost half in 10 years or 12 years. So I see progress like that, and I find that encouraging. In the treatment of animals, I also see some progress in terms of better attitudes towards animals. In some enlightened regions, better legislation. So the European Union has passed legislation which has improved the conditions of animals. It hasn't stopped factory farming. It's certainly not nearly gone far enough. But some of the things that I wrote about in the first edition of Animal Liberation are no longer legal in all 27 countries. I think it's 27 now that Europe, UK has left, but all 27 countries of the European Union. So that's progress, and even in some states of the United States, in California, for example, they have similar legislation. So I tend to look at the positive and work for the things that we can do. And probably I don't dwell as much on the past as your narrative suggested that you may do. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your answering. Yeah, just 2 points, because I'm not as dwelled in memory or pessimist even as I might have sound, because I really take actions now and there, very concrete actions, I would say, for veganism. But maybe conceptually, and I'm just talking about how philosophy should think about this, methodological and conceptual questions about animals, I am much more a Wittgensteinian than utilitarian. So this is why I also hope, and this is really a hope, that some kinds of narrative, some kinds of literature could help us to understand the reality of non-human animals and human animals better than maybe sometimes philosophy or even science. So this is why I'm taking the same path that some other Wittgensteinians are taking. So this is why I just, it's a kind of hope that literature could make us empathize more than philosophy does sometimes.
I certainly think that literature has a valuable role to play in that. I don't disagree with that. And I'm not sure if you had this in mind when you were talking about my connection with literature, but together with my wife, Renata Singer, we edited a collection called The Moral of the Story, in which we used extracts from literature to raise issues about morality. And I think we both really enjoyed that project. It got us reading a lot of different literature and looking at how it relates to morality. And I agree with you entirely that it has an important role there.
It's just an attempt to go a little further than sometimes philosophy can do. But thank you very much for your answering, and thank you for the opportunity to read my material to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you very much, Professor Giannini. Now we have some questions that were raised by the public audience on YouTube. I'm not able to read all of them because there were plenty of questions and we are almost running out of time. But we have selected 4 questions, right? Just so I can raise them to Professor Peter Singer, and then we can come to an end, right? So I'm going to read them right now. The first question was raised by Gabriel Almeida Prado, and he says, Professor Singer, what is your position on eating meat of animals which have hypothetically lived good lives, such as game? That's the first question. The second question was raised by Amanda Paganiella, and she says, what is your opinion on new stances on animal rights, such as the integrationist approach, as seen, for example, on Sue Donaldson's Zoopolis? The third question was raised by André Luiz Miraelo Barão Fantin, and he says, what are the problems of a Kantian ethics type absolute moral agreement on not causing harm to beings capable of feeling pain as a base for pro-animal ethics? And the last question that was already tackled in the last comment made by Professor Singer was raised by Felipe Docena, and he says, Professor Singer, do you believe that in practice animal liberation is possible without eliminating the capitalist system? If so, how to deal with large corporations that profit from animal exploitation? And these are the questions. Thank you very much for the public audience. Professor Singer, the microphone is yours, and thank you very much.
Good, and thank you for those questions, all of those whose questions were read out, and of course, thanks to all the others who didn't get your questions read out, but that's often the way it is. Okay, so I made some notes. First question was eating animals who have led good lives, particularly with the example of game. So I'm often asked this around Princeton, because Princeton is a town in an area where there is some forested land, and there are deer living in these forests. And of course, humans have eliminated the natural predators of these deer. Well, I guess there were 2 predators. There were originally perhaps wolves who were gone from this region, and the other predators were indigenous Americans, and they are no longer in this region either. So the deer do overpopulate, and they tend to die in winter. When winter comes, of course, there's very little to eat. There's snow on the ground for large parts of the winter. The trees have lost their leaves, and so they die. Some of them die from starvation. And the alternative is to shoot them. And there is hunting in the northeastern United States is in the fall. I have to say I generally don't approve of hunting, obviously, because it does cut short the lives of animals who can be living good lives. But in a situation like this where there are no natural predators, if hunting is restricted to people who are good shots and are able to put a bullet through the brain or the heart of an animal so the animal dies more or less instantly, perhaps that is a better ending than starving in the winter. In fact, certainly it is a better ending than starving in the winter. And so somewhat reluctantly, I have to say that I would not prohibit that kind of hunting, although I would limit it to people who have demonstrated that they have the right hunting ethic, that they are concerned to kill the animal instantly without suffering, and that they have the skill to do that. And then, of course, if they want to eat the meat of the animal, then I suppose that's acceptable. Certainly, in my judgment, it's far, far worse to walk down to the supermarket and to buy a piece of factory farm meat than it is to be a hunter who complies with those ethical guidelines. So, that may surprise some of my colleagues in the animal movement, but again, I think it's consistent with my utilitarian position. The second question was about the approach taken by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker in Zoopolis. It's an interesting contribution to the discussion about the treatment of animals. The idea, for those not familiar, is that animals, in a sense, can be regarded as citizens, and the citizens who can't represent themselves but can be represented by others in a political system. And I think that's a nice idea. There are two things that I had some problem with. One was that the book sort of justifies its existence by saying that the ethical arguments for treating animals better are not convincing people, and that's why we need to move to a political solution. But I can't see that in a democracy you're going to get a support for the idea of zoopolis, the idea of including animals as citizens, unless you've already persuaded people that animals have a moral status that means we shouldn't be treating them the way we're treating them now in factory farms. So I think that if you like, the rejection of the ethical argument approach, or the suggestion that something else was needed, is inconsistent with the success of the project itself. The second thing that I had some problem with is that the citizenship idea seemed to apply to domesticated animals, not only companion animals, but also farmed animals, but not to wild animals. And that they seem to be outside the system. And I couldn't really see a justification for leaving them out. I can see where that comes from in terms of the author's views, but I think that their interests ought to be counted in much the same way as the interest of other animals. So that's my response. Now, I must say I'm not an expert in this area. I did read the book when it came out, but I haven't followed all of the literature about it since. So there may have been things that have been said in that are not really, that cover the points I've made. I just don't know. Similarly, with regard to the third question, which was about a Kantian approach to animals, I'm also not an expert. It's clear that Kant himself had a really negative view of animals. He says explicitly that we don't have duties to animals because they're not self-aware beings, they're not autonomous beings. And he seems to think that we only have concerns for autonomous beings, but he doesn't explain then why we might have duties to infants or to intellectually disabled humans who are also not autonomous in the sense that animals are not. Kant himself, I think, got things very badly wrong and was really a relic of the earlier times in Europe. Go back to Thomas Aquinas and medieval views about animals, which were, again, completely dismissed them from moral concern. But you can have a Kantian approach which recognizes this as a mistake and tries to move beyond it. And Christine Korsgaard is, I think, the leading Kantian who's done that in a recent book. And I think she generally makes a good effort of showing that an approach that is Kantian in spirit can recognize Kant's mistake about saying we don't have duties to animals because they're not autonomous, and recognize that what matters for duties is consciousness or the capacity to suffer, which is essentially what Jeremy Bentham said, of course, a couple of hundred years ago. So I welcome Kantians like Korsgaard who try to show that a Kantian ethic can have a view of animals that was not Kant's own view. And then the final question was, again, about capitalism. Can we have animal liberation without capitalism? Well, I guess it's obvious from what I've already said that I certainly hope we can, because I can't see us as having animal liberation anytime soon if we have to get rid of capitalism first. And again, let me just echo what I said before. We have had non-capitalist societies in the 20th century, and perhaps to some extent do in the 21st century. I don't really regard China as a non-capitalist society. I'm not sure about Cuba today. I was in Cuba only at the very end of the 20th century, not in the last 20 years. So I don't really know. But so if you think of Soviet communism, it actually had these huge factory farms. It was an early pioneer of these collective farms, and it developed factory farms for animals. And even I was shocked to find the Israeli kibbutzim, the socialist collective settlements established by leftist pioneers in Israel, which were, I think, much better forms of communism than the Soviet model, still also had factory farms. I visited one in Israel many years ago that had a horrible chicken factory farm. So I don't think it follows that getting rid of capitalism will actually liberate animals. It will really still depends on the attitudes of the human beings who are responsible for making decisions. And that's why I think that we do need to change human attitudes. Getting rid of capitalism is not in itself enough. There was also a question about what can we do about corporations. Well, corporations exist by selling things that people buy. And that is one of the great benefits of the free market, if you like, of consumer society, that if you change the purchasing habits of consumers, you change the purchasing habit, you change what the corporations produce. Whereas, again, under Soviet communism, there would be a plan to produce this product. And if people didn't want that product, the product was still likely to be produced. So we have seen changes. Obviously, it's evident to anybody who goes into supermarkets. I'm sure this is true, at least in the affluent parts of Brazil, as well as in the rest of the world that I travel in, that you can now find in supermarkets a lot more vegan products than you could 10 years ago. And that is clearly the result of consumer demand. So big corporations are starting to recognize this. They're starting to invest in vegan products. Even corporations that are basically the worst and largest of the corporate animal production corporations, like Tyson's, for example, I think the biggest chicken producer and perhaps the biggest meat producer in the world, has invested in plant-based alternative products as well. So this is what we need to do. We need to change their priorities by changing the demand from consumers. I'm not saying that that's easy to do, but I do think that that's more hopeful and feasible than waiting for the overthrow of capitalism, which, as I said, I don't think will guarantee animal liberation anyway.
All right, so thank you very much, Professor Singer. It was an excellent session. I think everybody is happy right now. We're running out of time, so I would like to thank once again Professor Peter Singer, Professor Janine Sattler, Professor Daniela Rosendo, Professor Maria Elise da Silva, and also Gustavo and Renato Cani, who are here with us in the backstage. I would also like to thank the other members of the organizing committee, like Karine, Mayara, Talita, Fabio, Thor, and Iago, and also Professor Ivan Ferreira da Cunha. And of course, I would like to thank the general audience for being here. We are 150 people were watching us right now, and the video is going to be available on YouTube. So if you have the chance, please share it with other people. We'll try our best to, to put some subtitles in Portuguese in the video, just so we can spread this session. But other than that, I would like to thank you all very much for being here. And I would also like to say, stay safe, wear a mask if you can, stay at home if you can. And as soon as the pandemic is over, we shall meet again and have a good time. Right? So thank you very much once again, and have a good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you again to all the panelists. I really appreciate your contributions. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you again.